Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Logtech Live, April Fool's Day edition. No jokes for you until the end. This episode, I'm sorry, you're gonna have to wait for our traditional bad dad joke of the month till the end of the show. But in the meantime, you're stuck with me, Eric Johnson. I'm senior technology editor at the Journal of Commerce and also host of Logtech Live. So welcome back to those of you who've caught previous episodes, and welcome to those of you for where this is the first time you're catching the show. Thanks as always to our sponsor for the show, Fareye. Definitely encourage you to check them out if you're looking at if you have fulfillment, last mile kind of needs. Really interesting company. Also, thank you obviously to Sarah and her team at Let's Talk Supply Chain for hosting this show. I have a ton of fun, and I'm glad they keep asking me back to do it. So you're gonna have to bear with me a little bit today. This is no joke. I'm a little bit under the weather. A bunch of spring travel has finally caught up to me, and I think that either that or my son brought something home that he shared with me. Much to my chagrin. So, in either case, I will soldier on, and we have a great show today. Before I get into kind of our traditional news of the week, I'm really excited by our guest today. She's a longtime friend, literally one of the most knowledgeable people in our entire industry, especially when it comes to trade compliance and trade sort of policy. She's awesome. Beth Pride, CEO of BPE Global. So I'm going to be introducing her in a second. But first, as with every show, I wanted to walk through a few news items that were interesting to me and wanted to point you to. So first one is something that it's not just the logistics industry is feeling it. Obviously, we are all feeling it as well every time we refuel our cars, unless you are lucky enough to be driving a Tesla or a hybrid, and you don't have to worry about gasoline costs. Obviously, fuel costs are going absolutely bananas right now, not just up, but in terms of volatility. And that's having an impact on freight markets as well. Um, so there's a story that we did, and would just give us a quick second. We're having a little bit of technical issues on posting that story, but we can get you links to that later in the episode. Three of my colleagues at the JOC did a fantastic story about what rising fuel costs mean to various freight modes, ocean, trucking, even into intermodal. It's obviously going to have a big impact, right? Budgets are going to have to go up to account for fuel surcharges. Companies are going to have to make modal shifts to get around higher priced modes that they hadn't necessarily accounted for. We have a shipper talking in the story about literally telling customers we need to add a little bit more lead time to our delivery of our product to you so we can group more shipments together and cut down on those fuel costs. So um, yes, rising costs as a result of what's going on in Ukraine, Russia, and some fuel policy decisions as a result of that always are going to rebound on the freight markets. The question is, how much are they going to rebound and how much volatility can we expect? There's also this sort of traditional issue, and maybe this is something that we address later in Logtech Live. There's this traditional issue of the lag between when prices go up and when fuel surcharges are captured, right? And is there a way to minimize that lag, right? That's something I'll be monitoring and seeing if tech can play a role in doing that. Um, so next story, and again, we normally, as people who normally come to our show know, we normally post these stories within the LinkedIn Live and StreamYard console, but we're having a bit of technical difficulty, so we will post links to all these stories at some point during the show. So just look for those. The second story was I wrote a couple weeks ago about a new digital freight forwarder that actually just came on my radar a few weeks ago. It's a French company that's launching operations in North America. They're backed by the Bolloré Group, a big logistics provider, especially in Europe and Africa. And what's interesting is not so much that this particular company, although I think they are fairly interesting, especially with the backing of Bolloré, but is that this model keeps on humming, right? And I think there's been a lot of skepticism, whether it's about Flexport, whether it's about Fordo, who, by the way, have both landed massive new funding rounds over the last 2 months themselves. Um, you know, there was a theory that they were going to monopolize the market. Well, what's really happened is you've seen a lot of different versions of this digital freight forwarder kind of emerge over the last few years, and more are coming. And Lars Jensen, who's a well-known ocean freight analyst who writes in the JOC, and you see him everywhere. He's all over the place on LinkedIn, does a lot of presentations. He actually said at TPM last month that he expects somewhere between 10, in the tens of thousands of forwarders to disappear over the next decade. And while I absolutely trust Lars's instincts, I sort of disagree with him a little bit, in so much as, yes, there may be some companies that don't sort of embrace the digital mandate that's out in the market right now, but some will, and the tools that are there to help them will help them stay relevant. And the other part of it is, as I wrote in this story, um, because technology is so easy to build and adopt. Well, it's relatively easy. I can't build any of it, but people who can, it's a lot easier than it used to be, and cheaper. And it's cheaper to go out and buy stuff off the shelf, and it's easier to go out and get cloud storage on demand from and cloud infrastructure on demand from AWS and Azure and Google Cloud. All this stuff is much more manageable, and that means, yes, some forwarders will go away, but a lot more will be replaced by more and more digital entrants who are literally starting in this age right now. So just, I thought it was an interesting development that, you can read about a new company, but there's sort of a little bit of a indicator for where the forwarding market is likely to go over the next decade. And then the last thing I'll point out is my newsletter from last week. As many of you may know, I do a Substack newsletter each Friday. And the topic that I tackled last week, I told you my brain is not all there today. So the topic I tackled last week was about all of the various port and supply chain data initiatives that public entities in North America are tackling right now. Just in the last few weeks, we've had the White House come out with a new initiative that is meant to sort of highlight data exchange between all the parties in related to a shipment, essentially, across modes. The FMC has an ongoing initiative to understand data shortcomings, data gaps for every single stakeholder that's related to an international shipment. Those meetings are happening, and there's going to be some sort of summit around them in June, as we've talked about before. Port of Long Beach came out with a new platform called the Supply Chain Information Highway, also trying to address this. And so in the newsletter, which again we'll have a link to you in a bit, I just sort of address, like, is this the best approach? And I say that from the perspective of a shipper or an intermediary, or really anyone who's going to be needing to contribute data or read data from one, or pull data from one of these exchanges, and it's really complicated. It's super confusing. Not only do you have to know, like, what software is in the market for you to buy and invest in, now you also have to study, well, which of these initiatives is actually going to take hold, which of them might draw me in, which one of them might be required, which are going to be voluntary. It's extremely confusing, and it's not because there's a lack of good intentions. I think there's probably too much good intention and not enough coordination on these things. So that's an area I'll be exploring a lot more in joc.com as well, and obviously continuing to talk about it here. With no further ado, it's time for my croaky voice to talk less and bring in my guest this month, who is Beth Pride, CEO of BPE Global. I have known Beth a very long time. I've been reporting on this industry for 20 years. Probably the lion's share of that time I've known Beth. There literally is no one who's more smarter and more up to speed on all of the various things that importers and exporters face from a trade compliance and policy perspective. So Beth, delighted to join us. You could join us today. Can you, after you say hi, can you maybe give a little bit of that background and explain what BPE is?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's just so great to see you, and I hope you feel better. So I'm Beth Pride. I have the honor of leading BPE Global. We're a trade consulting company firm that's been around for 17 years. And Eric, I remember when you wrote about our 10-year anniversary. That was like such a big deal for us. So thank you, thank you, thank you. What we do what we do because we are crazy passionate about global trade. Like we go to the grocery store and we look at the country of origin of things and we calculate the landed cost if I want to buy a blouse. So it's fun what we do. And we help companies with the best technology, the best products. We help them get to their customers around the world. And we do this by explaining trade compliance regulations, showing our customers how to turn trade compliance into a strategic advantage. And some examples of strategic examples are things like reducing the barriers to obtaining foreign investment, or getting your product to the market sooner, or being able to hire the best and the brightest to develop your product regardless of their nationality. All of these are things that slow down companies and they don't think about it and how it ties to global trade compliance, but it's essential.
So give a little bit of background on before you started BP and how did this become your passion essentially?
Okay, so I can go way back. I started out as a truck driver and we got bought by an international company, and we quickly learned that delivering a package from point A to point B changed drastically when you needed to move it internationally. The amount of information, to your point earlier in your opening about the article you just wrote, the amount of data and information that you need is critical, and the accuracy of that information, understanding what an HTS number is and how to properly value your products. And so in working in the logistics and transportation industry on the international side, I realized that the big opportunity was to go and work for a global trade management solutions provider, where I had the privilege of being a VP of product management and product marketing. And I was able to develop these types of solutions and quickly saw that there is a huge need in the market for automation, for intelligence around crossing borders. And then unfortunately, but fortunately, when my last company didn't get its last round of funding, my CEO told me it was time for me to found BPE Global, and hence 17 years later, it's great.
Yeah, for sometimes those things that look bleak at the moment end up being super fortuitous. I'm glad it happened. I'm glad it happened. And you have a great team. I know most, if not all, of your team, and they're all fantastic. So let's. I want to circle back to the GTM part, because that's obviously a critical part of technology within the trade compliance space, and this is supposed to be a tech show, but we diverge into other topics as well. And obviously, there's no bigger topic right now on everybody's mind than the war in Ukraine. Can you sort of give people a frame of reference? I mean, there's been a lot of stuff talking about like freight movement and what that means, but there's also some sanction and trade compliance implications of what's going on in Ukraine right now, especially as it relates to Russia. Can you walk people through that? And I'm thinking sanctions, dual use items. You probably have 20 other things that you could mention, but
yeah, on February 24th, I woke up and my world changed. I mean, granted, I have power, I have heat, I'm not being shelled or bombed, but I wake up every morning in the war effort, which you wouldn't think of that as a global trade compliance consultant. But literally, the war has had significant impact on import and export activity. From an export perspective, the sanctions have created a situation where even if you can legally ship your product to Russia, you might not get paid. And so companies who are used to running global supply chains and not thinking twice about them actually have to stop and realize, should I turn off my supply chain because my Russian customer can no longer pay my bills. Over 85% of the financial institutions in Russia are sanctioned. And with several large carriers deciding to stop their Russia operations, it can also be a challenge just to get your product into the country. And then there's a moral issue, obviously, which a lot of companies are taking just a very firm stand on. It's not the Russian people, that's not the issue, but it's the Russian actions against the Ukraine that we need to take a moral stand on. So I want to give you some ideas. A lot of items that were products that were not considered dual use export items in the past. So these would be items like NIC controllers, optical circuits, things that were classified as anti-terrorism controls only into Russia. They are now controlled because they're classified in what's called export commodity control classifications, categories 3 through 9. And if something's in those categories that used to be able to go to Russia without a license, now it needs a license. And this is huge. So something that you would never think twice about. And as a company, you would have no export compliance program in place for because you had no license requirements. You all of a sudden need to know how to apply for an export license. Even if you knew how to apply for an export license, the policy is one of denial right now. So reality is you're not going to be able to get paid. You probably can't find somebody to pick it up and ship it and deliver it. And even if you ask permission to get the license, you're going to be denied. I want to just highlight some of the things that companies maybe aren't thinking about. So you have to worry about things like software maintenance and perpetual licenses tripping the sanctions regulations. You also have to understand this concept of beneficial ownership. So meaning what percentage ownership does each of the stockholders have? So if BPE had a Russian oligarch in our shareholders, which we don't, by the way, but if there was an oligarch in our board, you'd have to know if they owned 50% or more of the company, and if they were a sanctioned entity. And if they are, you're not allowed to do business, certain kinds of business. And you actually have to pick up the war effort, and you have to do this thing called a blocking activity, where you literally say, hello, sanctioned customer, I want your business, give me your money, and I'm going to block it. I'm going to hold it in an account until the sanctions are resolved. Remember, one of our trading cards with Iran was we'll release millions, billions in dollars of funds that have been blocked from you because you were sanctioned if you behave better.
Like a sanctioned escrow account, essentially.
Exactly. And so we, as companies on the front of the war, if we're dealing with these blocked entities, we have to go create those escrow accounts and make sure that we don't refund any money to those sanctioned entities. People have automatic credits or rebates that are triggered in their business, and that could trigger a sanction. So it's not as easy as, oh, I don't ship anything that's a worry. It's all EAR 99 stuff. That doesn't happen. So people have to think about it. Also on the import side, and a lot of people aren't thinking about import, but the US intends to take away Russia's most favored nation status. And so I sat there and said, oh, I could say the average duty rate will increase to such and such, but the rates are going to range, huge ranges. And so I'm not going to give you a flat fee. I thought I'd take the number one import from Russia, and that's vodka. I'll say it right, vodka. And so right now, importing vodka from Russia is duty-free. Once the MFN rate goes away, it's going to be $3.08 per proof of liquor to bring in vodka. And so, first of all, it's going to be a very expensive shot of vodka, and people might not be able to afford to bring it in. And so that's a thing to consider. So the bottom line is that these sanctions, they aren't simple. And not only is there a regulatory aspect, but you always have that moral imperative to help the Ukrainian people and take a stand, and I'm going to cry, against unprovoked cruelty. This is just crappy. So we love our clients who have decided to take this political position so that they can make an impact, and we want to help as many people as we can to understand how they can do that too. Because these walls that are closing in around Russia are not closing in just because of the sanctions. They're closing in because of the global multinational companies that are standing right beside those sanctions and agreeing to build taller walls. It's been fantastic.
Yeah. I told you Beth was passionate, so so fantastic. I mean, honestly, we could spend the whole 30 minutes just talking about this issue. I know, and really appreciate it. Seriously, if anyone has any interest in exploring this further, Beth, I definitely encourage you to reach out to Beth. She is literally the wealth of information on this. So let's shift gears, because there's another issue that I've been very curiously watching over the last couple of years, especially as we transition from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. And this impacts a lot more people sort of in the import-export world, because it relates to Chinese goods that are being imported into the US. We still have basically the same tariffs in place that were put in place under the Trump administration on all Chinese-made goods. Why do we still have those? If you can answer that, and do you think that well, actually, let's focus on that first before I get too scatterbrained about the bigger implications. Why are these tariffs still in place? Is there any hope that they get scaled back in any way?
So the reality is that nothing has changed with how China has threatened U.S. national security related to technology transfer and intellectual property. Shocker, those section tariffs didn't change China's behavior. Isn't that a shocker? The reality is that section tariff policy was so myopic and ignorant, and it just punishes U.S. businesses and not China. The issue is that the wolves aren't just going to let the tariff go without getting something in return. And this is where I'm going to bring you back into my daily world, which is the war. So something that a lot of people haven't thought about is that the Russia war on Ukraine could change the mindset against China. If China were to rebuke Putin for his actions, countries like the US might see that act as a symbol of protecting what is just and right in this world. And China's condemnation of Russia's illegal attacks on a sovereign nation would actually be a very valuable trade negotiation tool. And those tariffs might be in play if China were able to be a weapon against Putin. And so that's a big, big thing that nobody's going to talk about at the official level, because those discussions just don't happen there. But I'm absolutely hoping and praying that China, with its big voice, will get on the right side of this war and be rewarded for that, because we need to stop these people from hurting.
What your clients who import from China into the US, have they just sort of like accounted for these tariffs being in place forever, or is there some sort of is there still some language in their sort of budget around, well, hopefully these tariffs eventually go away or get reduced? What's their sort of mindset around that?
So they're definitely budgeting for them, but then I want to give you a couple examples. I mean, there are some clients who are doing tariff engineering and recognizing that they can redesign their products so that they move from one list to another. The lists have different rates.
Right.
And so based on how they design their products, they could get into a lower rate. And one of the thrilling projects I worked on last year with regards to these section tariffs is a manufacturing company came to me and said, we're going to move production to either Canada or Mexico because we can't afford not only the 25% tariff into the US, but once we've made the machines, we can't afford the 30% tariff when we sell those machines in China. So they were paying 25% on the components and 30% on the finished goods sold into their primary market, which was China. When we looked at it, the cost to move it offshore to Canada and Mexico, if we just looked at the duty rates, yeah, they'd save some money. But when we went and looked at the actual bill of material of the machines they were manufacturing, they had misclassified a majority of the main components. And we are actually able to reduce 17% of their actual cost by correctly classifying their components and coming up with the correct duty for the item and the correct classification of the major machine, and stopped sourcing some of the components from China. So they were able to keep the manufacturing in the US. People just don't look all the way deep enough, and this is where I get a little excited. They just don't go deep enough into their products to really see what's leading to that total cost that is cost prohibitive for manufacturing in the US. So the end of the story was they didn't move manufacturing.
Interesting. Yeah. I would agree. I think, especially the last couple of years, like people have been, I think, paralyzed almost by what's gone on in the market, and it's very difficult to, the cliche of changing the airplane engine while it's in flight is always difficult, right? But it's probably more necessary than ever. One last question, and this came up. I'm asking this because I was sort of tracking via Twitter the Ambassador Tai's hearing yesterday in front of, I think it was the Senate, some Senate committee about trade agreement, and I don't know if you caught any of this, but
I did not.
There was, good for you. There was some discussion around, kind of what America's sort of policy is going to be around negotiating for trade agreements. And can we, at one point, one of the senators asked, we should have been prioritizing, relations and market access in Indo-Pacific nations. And it's like, oh, if only there was a trade agreement that did that 5 years ago, 6 years ago. But I mean, do you see any sort of long-term mindset change around how we deal with trade, or how we negotiate and participate in trade agreements versus, 5, 6 years ago?
No. So luckily the previous administration is just a blip. And canceling and withdrawing from trade agreements, which just didn't make sense. And so, unfortunately, the way trade agreements are arranged, it's a pretty cookie cutter process. I mean, look at USMCA. It's almost identical to NAFTA. So even though he said he was renegotiating and changing the rules are pretty darn similar. So I don't expect that will change. But to that point is, we did have a trade agreement ironed out and ready to be signed that he withdrew us from, that we could jump back into, that would add just tremendous advantage to the United States being in that group of countries. So yay, I hope they revive it.
I mean, we've talked about kind of the two probably biggest issues of the day, but what do you see importers and exporters kind of reaching out to you the most often about these days? What's keeping them up at night beyond what we've already discussed?
Money. So companies want to take on foreign investment. So they're at a point where they need cash, and a lot of foreign investors are absolutely willing and ready to fund them. Companies don't understand that there's new regulations under the Committee for Foreign Investment in the United States. CFIUS is what it's called.
Yep.
And basically, there is a trigger that says, if you're going to take foreign money, you need to tell us whether you have critical technology. And shocker, anybody running an AWS or Azure or Google platform is going to be considered critical technologies. And so all these companies are all of a sudden in critical technologies, and they really didn't have an export control program, or they didn't know their export commodity control number for their product. And so they reach out to us to determine their ACCNs, and that maps to critical technologies, and we can help them determine if they have to go for a deeper CFIUS review. And so anybody planning on getting acquired, taking funding, going public, you absolutely need to know where you are in the world of export controls. You also need to know if you've ever had any export violations or what your export position is, so that you can make reps and warranties on that activity. And companies are just coming up like, what is this? Help me put this together. That's not good. We're also seeing companies that have bought companies, and when they put in the programs, the trade compliance programs, they uncover some things like, oh, maybe they thought that if an item was imported from China into Canada and then Canada into the US, they could claim country of origin Canada. And they failed to pay the Section 301 duties, so they end up owing millions of unpaid Section tariffs. And that's a huge burden on the company that does the acquisition. And so these types of things are hitting companies left and right. And they're just like, how do we deal with this? How do we get this correctly done? And back to the other point, there's free trade agreements. Companies just don't know how to qualify their products for free trade agreements. So getting that right. They look to their suppliers and say, give me a certificate for free trade agreements. And the supplier gives them a bad cert. They don't know whether it's good or bad. And so just, again, helping people to know how to do correct trade compliance and pay the lowest or zero duties is a really, really big deal.
And how, just one little addendum to that, how often do you need to be examining these things? Obviously, it's going to differ depending on what exactly even some of the examples you mentioned. Is this a once a year exercise? Is this like once a quarter? Do I need some system or person telling me, no, we need to be monitoring this more often? Like how often is that cadence?
So I'm going to use the same answer that I started with, which is money. It does not matter. There's not a prescribed amount of time you have to do it. You literally should run a report that says, where am I spending my money? And you should take your top 10% of cash that you're spending and go deep into that area and make sure that it's done right. And look at alternatives and look at tariff engineering, offshoring, everything else that you can consider doing. And then constantly whittling away at that list of costs and then refreshing, because new costs come up as new duties are assessed, new penalties and anti-dumping, things like that. So again, it should be ongoing. You're at a big advantage if you actually have a trade compliance solution that can help you target those things.
So that's perfect segue. Nice work into our next.
Well done.
Yeah. So for everyone listening in, Beth and I and her team used to write a white paper when I used to be at American Shipper. It was the first one we did every year, right? It was like January, February, somewhere in that time frame. And it was always trying to explain some facet of global trade management technology that people ought to orient themselves around. And I feel like if I went back and I haven't read those in a while, but I feel like if I went back and read those, we probably could just run them verbatim even still today, and they would still be applicable. So, have you seen anything change in terms of like adoption levels and also drivers to adoption? My contention has always been people come to GTM or any sort of trade compliance management tools reactively rather than proactively. Am I wrong on that?
Yeah, I miss writing that report.
I know.
My employees had it in their performance reviews that they had to write at least one a year.
Well, we'll figure out some other way to do it. So
yeah, we'll figure out another way. So, I mean, you're right, Eric. Not much has changed in terms of adoption. We're seeing people implement a GTM solution because it's required by the lender. So, I mean, that actually has helped. But I'm on my soapbox now. You can picture me stepping up onto it. The problem is they're like, you have to do restricted party screening. In the world of the lenders, they think just don't do business with bad parties. Lenders are not intelligently saying, implement a solution that helps you reduce your duties and your operating costs and reduce your violations with failure to get export licenses. And until lenders require that kind of stuff, the adoption rate is still going to be an issue. But here's the other thing. Some of the lenders only understand OFAC, Office of Foreign Assets and Controls, and the fact that you can't do business with bad actors in sanctioned countries. And so we've seen a ton of mandated GTM implementations. And when we go look at what they implemented, they only implemented a portion of the lists that you should be screening against. I mean, we have a set list of BIS and other global entities, EU, UN, UK, bad actors that we test. And it's like, they never even thought to screen against them. And so if you're running a global business, you need to screen against not just OFAC. If you're running a US business, you need to add in the BIS, the State Department list. And if you have, activities anywhere else, you've got to get those local lists. So we've also seen companies, and hopefully the government's not listening, they only screen revenue transactions, and they're not looking at the non-revenue transactions. So I just saw a beautiful freebie that shipped to Iran, and it went to Iran because it was a freebie. It didn't get caught in the system. And so that kind of stuff is really, really scary. And so, I mean, what's a CEO to do that's got a, budget, and they've got to come up with, what are they going to buy? But the reality is one size does not fit all. And import and export compliance means different things to different industries and to companies at different phases. Are you emerging? Are you fading? Are you about to go public? All those wonderful things. So it's essential that you have an export compliance program when you're about to go public. You don't have to have a crazy program when you're just tinkering and figuring out what you're actually going to be when you grow up. But it's important to know what export controls you have when you're tinkering, so that you don't cross a line and fail to get an export license if you hire a Chinese person to build your product. And if you're crossing any border, importing or exporting, it's really critical that you know what an HTS, a Schedule B, an ECCN are, because you're taking those numbers and putting them on government declarations, and that's an official declaration that you are attesting to. And if you make a misstatement, there's lots of penalties, and I don't play the penalty game. If you work with me, we don't get penalties, but don't be ignorant. Know what you're making as far as declarations to the federal governments that you're making declarations to. People don't even keep copies of what they've said. So that's my soapbox. I'll back off.
So, I mean, the sort of landscape of GTM providers has changed a lot in the last 10 years. There's been consolidation. A lot of them have been either acquired into other providers or into bigger, like, sort of logistics product suites. There's also been a number of sort of newer, this is going to seem derogatory, but I mean it complimentary, GTM light type approaches, especially for smaller shippers that have cross-border, like, retail orders that they're getting, and they need a tool to help them figure out landed cost and duties and some of those licenses issues, right? Is that the way that this market sort of reaches more of its potential, is through those sort of like lighter solutions that are more purpose-built around, a small retail outlet that is getting orders in all sorts of crazy places?
Yeah, so we have to be careful there, because a lot of those light solutions just don't go deep enough. And I'll give you an example. If I'm sending tennis shoes and I have one style of shoe, I may have multiple classifications for that shoe based on gender. Men versus women are two separate classifications, and certain sizes have different classifications. And the components, so if I have a leather version versus a cloth version, I could easily, and then if I sell it to 10 different countries, I could easily have 100 different HTS numbers for that one shoe. So there is no light. There is just, people say, give us your catalog and we'll classify everything for you. Yeah. It's not that simple. And I really caution people to do the heavy lifting to understand what it is that their products are. And it has to be the manufacturer that does that lifting. Yep. You can't expect a third party like the freight forwarder to do it. But that brings me back around to the freight forwarders that are building technology, not just moving freight, but classification, license determination into their products. They have been expected to save the shippers for, since the dawn of the logistics industry. Right. And they're finding that they can't do it manually. And so they're building solutions to do it. So that will help raise awareness, but we have to start pushing back when we know that people have incorrectly classified their products. So just bottom line is GTM technology has to reach its potential. It will never go away, and it has to be adopted. And there are some companies that are realizing that global trade regulations can either bind or free their operations. And once they get global trade and they get how to do it correctly, then they run a profitable and ethical company. And they've got to get there to be a good company. And underestimating those trade compliance regulations will impact your market cap. So we got to get this fixed. It's not fixed yet. You're right. Our report, I'm afraid it would be exactly, probably we could just rebrand it.
Yeah.
And here's the other scary thing. The reality is GTM experts are aging out and retiring. I'm never going to retire, by the way. But there aren't a lot of young ones lining up to take our jobs. But the US government isn't going to slack, or any government is not going to stop the enforcement. So there's going to be a real tough rub where people wake up going, oh, crap, I'm getting caught and I don't even know how to respond to it.
Yeah, and I don't even have anyone to turn to help me with this.
Exactly. And that's where I'm going to close this, is the hope, the sliver, the glimmer is AI. And I really think that we will see AI coming to the rescue. But again, it falls to the manufacturers to help define what goes into that AI, not the crap that people have put into the systems up until today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Beth, my mind's always blown every time I talk to you. So thank you so much for dropping all this insight on us. And as I said a couple times, please reach out to, what's a good way for people to get in touch with you?
BPEglobal.com. You can find us. We can contact us from there.
Okay.
Yeah, we'd love to talk to you.
Okay, cool. Definitely encourage you, even if you just want to chat about this stuff. Beth's a great person to, as you can tell, to talk about. So thank you so much for making some time early in the morning in San Francisco. Really appreciate it. And we'll talk soon.
All right. Take care.
Bye, Beth. All right. Boy, I need to recover from my brain, my already addled brain being overflowing with information. Beth's awesome. Hope you enjoyed that discussion. It's time for, we're gonna really dumb it down now and go to the bad dad joke of the month section. So this is straight from my son. I could not think of a good one this week. So this is straight from my son. So direct all complaints to him. What does a flower and an A have in common? I'll give you a second. They're both followed by a B. Get it? Buzz, buzz, buzz. Okay, that's our spring joke of the season. Let's now get into something a little more substantive, our buzzword of the month. And this month, I wanted to focus on trade finance. So trade finance isn't necessarily technology in and of itself, but what I have seen and been reporting on a bunch over the last couple months, and having a bunch of conversations about is whether trade, and it's also not anything terribly new, right? Trade finance has been around for a while, and by trade finance we mean financing the goods inside of a box or a truck or an air freighter. I think what we've seen over the last couple of years, the last couple of years, in fact, but especially a lot of activity in the last couple months is around giving shippers tools for being able to finance their goods in new and innovative ways, opening up access to both the company needing capital or extended credit terms and the financiers for the that are actually doing the financing, right? Instead of it just being around a letter of credit or an open line of credit. I'm not a finance person, so I don't. I'm probably mischaracterizing that second piece, but instead of the sort of traditional method in which suppliers get funding, essentially to build manufacture the goods according to a purchase order, figuring out a way to tether that to historical data around logistics networks and freight behavior, and tethering that data to underwriting the financing of the goods. Lots of activity in this space. There has been a lot of activity, but it feels like we're reaching a bit of a crescendo because it's coinciding with the emergence of payment tools that make electronic cross-border payment a lot easier than it's been in the past. So I think we'll see those things kind of evolve and progress in tandem, and there's going to be lots of interesting opportunities for forwarders to offer those as products and shippers to use them to reduce their working capital burden. So I'm very bullish on this space. I think the time is kind of finally right for it. I did a Substack newsletter on this at some point in 2020 or 21, which is maybe worth checking out again, both you and me, so I can remember what I wrote. So with that, that's we've reached the end of another great show. Thank you again to Beth for joining us. Definitely reach out to her. Thank you to Fareye once again for sponsoring this awesome discussion. And we will see you all in a month's time. And look forward to seeing all of you online on Twitter and Substack and joc.com. Please reach out to me anytime, anyway. I'm available via a million different channels. Always appreciate the support for the show. Thanks again to Sarah and her team at Let's Talk Supply Chain, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.